Elena Harper had spent years blending into the shadows, a master of observation unnoticed by those she surveilled. But today, her disguise wasn't enough to shield her from the gaze of one man, a cop who didn't see her badge, her mission, or her professionalism. He only saw her skin. And with that, everything she had built began to unravel. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Elena Harper pedaled slowly down the quiet suburban street, her senses on high alert. She had been trained for high-pressure situations like this, but something about being in the middle of this serene neighborhood with its manicured lawns and peaceful atmosphere added an extra layer of tension. Her assignment was straightforward. Tail a suspect connected to a string of high-profile robberies. The FBI had been watching him for months, but today was critical. Elena was positioned as the closest agent, instructed to keep her distance, but stay close enough to follow the suspect's every move. Disguising herself as a casual cyclist was a strategic choice. On a bicycle, she could blend in without drawing attention, just another person going about their day. But this wasn't just any neighborhood. It was a place where unfamiliar faces were quickly noticed, and the sight of a black woman riding through the streets would undoubtedly raise questions that Elena had no time for. Her real challenge wasn't the suspect. It was making sure she stayed invisible in plain sight. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows on the street, and children played in the nearby park as the last of the daylight lingered. Elena kept her eyes trained ahead, occasionally glancing at her phone, pretending to be just another person scrolling through social media or checking the time. In reality, she was monitoring her suspect's movements through an encrypted app. Suddenly, the distant hum of a car engine grew louder, and a police cruiser rolled into view at the far end of the street. Elena tensed, her instincts kicking in. It was routine for cops to patrol these kinds of areas, but she had learned over the years that routine often carried layers of complexity. She prayed this patrol would pass by without incident, but deep down, she knew that wasn't going to happen. The cruiser came to an abrupt stop, and Elena glanced out of the corner of her eye. Sure enough, the officer was stepping out, his movements deliberate and purposeful, walking toward her with an air of authority. She didn't have to look long to know exactly what was coming. "Hey, you!" The officer's voice rang out, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere of the neighborhood. Elena looked up slowly, maintaining her composure. She could feel the eyes of the few people walking by, now fully focused on her. The officer, a tall, square-jawed man with a scowl etched into his face, wasn't approaching her as someone curious or concerned.
He was approaching her with suspicion already clouding his judgment. "Can I help you, officer?" Elena asked, keeping her tone measured. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford distractions, especially not now. The officer stopped just a few feet from her, his gaze scanning her up and down as if trying to size her up. "What are you doing here?" His voice was demanding, with a slight edge that implied she didn't belong. Elena swallowed the irritation rising in her throat. "Just riding my bike," she replied. "Is there a problem?" The officer crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "This isn't your neighborhood, is it? You don't look like someone who lives here." There it was, the subtle accusation that carried more weight than the words themselves. Elena had dealt with this before, in too many places to count. But right now, she didn't have time to engage in a back and forth that could blow her cover. "Officer, I'm not breaking any laws. I'm just passing through," she said calmly, trying to defuse the situation. But the look in his eyes told her he wasn't interested in de-escalation. "You people think you can just show up wherever you want and not expect anyone to notice," the officer muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Elena to hear. Elena clenched her fists on the handlebars, the weight of his words settling over her. "You people?" She had heard it before, but it didn't sting any less. Her heart beat faster, but she reminded herself of her training. "Stay calm. Don't let this escalate." "I don't see why that's relevant," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm minding my own business." The officer's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer. "You need to come with me," he said, his voice authoritative, leaving no room for discussion. Elena blinked, caught off guard by the abrupt escalation. Excuse me? I'm not asking, he said, reaching for her arm. You're coming with me, now. Elena's pulse spiked. This was not happening. Not now. She had done everything by the book, and yet here she was, being dragged into a situation that was spiraling out of control. If she resisted, it would make things worse. If she revealed her true identity, it could compromise her mission. Either way, she was trapped. Officer, you're making a mistake, Elena said, her voice firmer now. The officer didn't respond. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs, his grip tightening on her arm. Elena had no choice but to let him arrest her, even though she could feel every fiber of her being screaming against the injustice. She had been trained for moments like this, but training didn't prepare you for the sting of humiliation in real time. As he locked the cuffs around her wrists, Elena felt the gaze of the neighborhood bearing down on her. She was no longer just an FBI agent on a mission. She was now a black woman being arrested in broad daylight for no reason other than existing in a space she wasn't supposed to be in. Mason Donovan, the officer's nameplate read. Elena made a mental note, knowing that this was far from over. He had no idea who he had just handcuffed, but soon, very soon, he would. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a neighborhood buzzing with gossip. Elena sat in the back, staring out the window as the streets passed by, her hands still cuffed, her mission now compromised. But this wasn't the end. Not for her. Not for Officer Mason Donovan. Karma had a way of catching up, and it was coming fast. Elena sat quietly in the back seat of the police cruiser, her wrists bound by the cold metal of the handcuffs. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine as Officer Mason Donovan drove them toward the station. She kept her eyes focused on the passing scenery, taking deep, steady breaths. She had been trained to handle situations far more volatile than this. But the weight of this particular moment wasn't just about her arrest. It was about something deeper. It was about the years of prejudice, the assumptions made about her before she even had the chance to speak. Elena's mind raced as she tried to maintain her composure. She had been on the brink of a breakthrough in her mission, tailing the suspect who was believed to be involved in a string of high-profile robberies. Now, thanks to Officer Donovan's baseless arrest, her investigation was at risk. She couldn't blow her cover, not yet. Revealing her identity as an FBI agent would ruin months of hard work. But her patience was wearing thin. As they neared the police station, Elena's thoughts wandered back to her early years, to the many times she had been underestimated, dismissed, or judged based on the color of her skin. She had always been the type to rise above, using every slight and every assumption as fuel to push harder, to climb higher in a system that wasn't built for her success. But no matter how high she rose, moments like these reminded her that some battles were still far from over. The cruiser came to a stop outside the station, and Mason got out, opening her door with a smirk plastered across his face. He was proud of himself, confident that he had done his job by detaining someone he believed didn't belong in his neighborhood. Elena could feel his arrogance radiating as he roughly guided her out of the car and into the building. "Let's go, Miss Cyclist. Time to answer some questions," Mason said, his tone dripping with condescension. Elena remained silent, knowing that any response she gave would only provoke him further. She had learned early in life that sometimes silence was the most powerful response, especially when dealing with people who had already decided who you were before you even opened your mouth. As they entered the station, the bustling activity inside came to a halt. Officers and staff turned to stare, their eyes darting between Mason and the handcuffed woman at his side. Elena noticed the flicker of confusion in their expressions. This wasn't the kind of station where arrests like this happened often, especially not of someone who looked like her. Mason led her to an interrogation room, pushing the door open and motioning for her to sit down. Elena complied, watching as he leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, waiting for her to say something, anything, that would justify his actions. But she remained quiet, her gaze level, meeting his with a calm intensity that only seemed to irritate him more. "So, you gonna tell me why you were really in that neighborhood, or are we gonna do this the hard way?" Mason asked, pacing slowly in front of her. Elena raised an eyebrow, her voice measured when she finally spoke. "I told you, I was riding my bike. Mason chuckled darkly, shaking his head. See, I don't buy that. You think I don't know when someone's up to something? I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone doesn't belong. Elena's patience was wearing thin, but she maintained her calm. I didn't break any laws, officer. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Mason stopped pacing and leaned in closer, his face just inches from hers. People like you always have something to hide, he muttered, his eyes cold. And I'm gonna find out what it is. Elena didn't flinch. She had dealt with far more intimidating figures in her line of work. Staff, and Mason Donovan was not one of them. But, as much as she wanted to put him in his place, she knew she had to wait. Timing was everything, and Mason was about to learn a very hard lesson. The door to the interrogation room swung open, and a senior officer walked in, his face stern. Mason, can I have a word with you outside? Mason straightened up, looking a bit confused but not overly concerned. Sure, Captain, he said, glancing at Elena before heading out the door. Elena could hear muffled voices outside the room, though she couldn't make out what they were saying. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She had no doubt about what was happening. Her FBI handler had likely made the necessary phone calls by now. Mason's world was about to come crashing down, and she was more than ready to watch it unfold. After a few minutes, the door opened again. This time, Mason's expression had changed. The arrogance that had defined his every movement earlier was gone, replaced by a mix of confusion and anger. You, he began, his voice shaky, why didn't you say anything? Elena tilted her head slightly, her expression neutral. Say what exactly? Mason's face reddened. That you're FBI, that you're a federal agent. Why didn't you say anything? Elena met his gaze with a calm intensity. Because you never asked, and frankly, it's not my job to educate you on how to do yours. Mason clenched his jaw, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. The captain stepped into the room, his tone firm. Agent Harper, you're free to go. I apologize for the misunderstanding. Elena stood up, smoothing out her jacket, her hands free of the handcuffs now. No need to apologize, Captain. I'll be filing a formal report with my superiors. Mason's face paled at her words. He knew exactly what that meant. His actions were going to be scrutinized, and there would be consequences. Elena didn't need to say it, but the gravity of his mistake hung heavy in the air. As she walked out of the station, Elena felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Anger, frustration, exhaustion. She had dealt with men like Mason Donovan her entire life, and every time it chipped away at her patience, at her resolve. But she wouldn't let this incident break her. She had a job to do, and she was damn good at it. As she stepped outside into the evening air, Elena pulled out her phone, quickly checking the status of her mission. The suspect was still in the area, still on the move. Her brief detour at the police station hadn't derailed her completely, and for that, she was grateful. But as she mounted her bicycle and began pedaling away, she knew this encounter with Mason Donovan wasn't over. Karma had a funny way of coming back around, and she had no doubt that Mason would soon feel its full weight. Mason Donovan sat in his patrol car, the weight of the earlier events hanging over him like a dark cloud. The ride back to the station after Elena Harper's release had been a long, uncomfortable silence. Every time he replayed the encounter in his mind, the knot in his stomach tightened. He had made a mistake, a monumental one. The news had spread quickly through the station, and while no one had said it to his face, the judgment in their eyes was clear. A police officer who had arrested an undercover FBI agent for no valid reason. He could already see the headlines in tomorrow's paper. It had all happened so fast. 1 minute he was doing his job, responding to what he thought was suspicious behavior, and the next, he was being told by his captain that the woman he had cuffed and hauled into the station was a federal agent. Worse still, an agent on an active, high-level operation. The reality of what that meant was sinking in now, and the consequences were far from over. Mason stared out the windshield, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, firm, fair, and observant. But today, he wasn't any of those things. Today, he was the guy who let his assumptions take over. He had been trained to evaluate situations critically, but instead, he had fallen back on his biases, and now his career was hanging by a thread. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him, and when he glanced down, his heart sank. It was a message from his superior. "We need to talk. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." Mason let out a long breath, the weight of that message pressing on his chest. He knew exactly what that meeting would be about. His actions were going to be reviewed. And that meant there would be an investigation, internal interviews, paperwork, and most likely, disciplinary measures. The thought made his hands tremble slightly. How could everything have gone so wrong? He had spent years on the force, climbing the ranks slowly but steadily. He wasn't the best at making friends with the higher-ups, but he had always believed that his record spoke for itself. Now, that record was tainted, and he had no one to blame but himself. He had seen Elena Harper, seen her skin color, and assumed she didn't belong in that neighborhood. He hated to admit it to himself, but the truth was undeniable. His actions were driven by prejudice. Mason slammed his fist against the steering wheel, frustration bubbling up. How had he let it get this far? He wasn't a bad person. He wasn't a racist. At least, he had never thought of himself that way. But now, as he sat in his car, replaying the events in his head, he couldn't escape the reality of what had happened. He had acted out of bias. He had made assumptions without evidence. And worse, he had humiliated an innocent woman, a woman who had been doing her job. A job that, as an FBI agent, required far more courage and skill than anything he had ever done. Suddenly, the memory of her calm, steady gaze in the interrogation room came flooding back. She hadn't flinched when he leaned in close, hadn't raised her voice or lost her composure. Elena Harper had been in control the entire time, even as he tried to intimidate her. And now, in hindsight, Mason could see just how far out of his depth he had been. He had allowed his biases to blind him, to lead him down a path that was now threatening to ruin everything he had worked for. And the worst part? He couldn't take it back. The damage was done. The next morning, Mason stood outside the precinct, his feet heavy as he made his way inside. His meeting with his superior loomed ahead, and he knew it wouldn't be a pleasant one. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as guilt gnawed at him. His wife had asked him what was wrong, but he hadn't told her the full story. He wasn't ready to admit, even to her, that he might be the bad guy in this situation. When he entered the captain's office, the air was thick with tension. Captain Hernandez sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Mason closed the door behind him and stood at attention, trying to remain as professional as possible. But the pit in his stomach told him that no amount of formality could undo what had happened. "Take a seat, Donovan," Hernandez said, his voice clipped. Mason obeyed, sitting down across from his captain, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He braced himself for the scolding that was sure to come, but the captain's tone was calm, almost too calm. "You're aware of the gravity of the situation, I assume?" Hernandez began, folding his hands on the desk. "Yes, sir," Mason replied, his voice strained. Hernandez leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You arrested a federal agent, an FBI agent who was in the middle of an undercover operation. Do you realize what kind of chaos that could have caused?" Mason swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Hernandez's voice hardened, his frustration slipping through. "That's putting it lightly. This isn't just about one bad call. This is about the way you handled yourself. You escalated a situation that didn't need escalating, and you humiliated an innocent woman in the process." Mason winced at the word humiliated. It stung more than he thought it would. Hernandez continued, his voice now tinged with disappointment. "We're going to have to open an internal review. There will be consequences for your actions, Mason. And frankly, you should consider yourself lucky if you keep your badge after this." Mason's heart sank further. He had known the investigation was coming, but hearing it spoken out loud made it feel real, like the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "You're suspended, effective immediately," Hernandez said, leaning back in his chair. "We'll review the situation and make a decision after the investigation is complete." Mason's mouth went dry. Suspended. It was a word he had never expected to hear in relation to his own career. The shame of it settled over him like a suffocating blanket, and all he could do was nod in acknowledgement. "Dismissed," Hernandez said, turning his attention back to the paperwork on his desk. Mason stood up, his legs shaky as he made his way out of the office. The walk back to his car felt like it took hours, every step weighed down by the knowledge that his career, his life, was hanging in the balance. When he finally reached his car, he sat behind the wheel, staring blankly ahead. The reality of his situation hit him like a tidal wave. He had been suspended, and his future was now uncertain. But beyond the professional consequences, there was something deeper gnawing at him. The realization that he wasn't the man he thought he was. The word racist echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake it. He had always prided himself on being fair, on treating people with respect, but now he was questioning everything. Was he really just another cop who saw a black woman and assumed the worst? Was he no different from the officers he had criticized in the past? Mason felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had spent years building his career, trying to do good in his community, but now all of that was crumbling because of one terrible, prejudiced decision. As the days passed, Mason found himself spiraling deeper into guilt and self-reflection. He couldn't escape the feeling that karma was coming for him, that the universe was delivering the consequences he deserved. And no matter how much he tried to rationalize his actions, the truth was inescapable. He had wronged Elena Harper, and he had to face the fallout. The days following Mason Donovan's suspension felt like an eternity. He had gone from a respected officer in the community to someone under scrutiny, not just from his department, but from within himself. Each morning, as he sat in his kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. The conversations with his wife had grown more strained, the once easy banter replaced by awkward silences and sideways glances. Mason wasn't the only one feeling the fallout. His family could sense the tension too. He spent his days at home, replaying the incident with Elena Harper over and over in his mind. What had made him act that way? Why had he assumed the worst about her without even a second thought? Each question led to more self-doubt, and every answer pointed toward an uncomfortable truth. His prejudice had guided his hand that day, not his duty as an officer of the law. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into Mason's conduct continued. He had been questioned multiple times by internal affairs, his colleagues distancing themselves from him, both out of professional caution and personal disappointment. There were no more jokes in the break room, no friendly nods of acknowledgement. The isolation was suffocating, and Mason was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about his career, it was about who he was as a person. One afternoon, as Mason sat in his living room, flipping mindlessly through TV channels, his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a text message from an unfamiliar number. "We need to meet. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., cafe near the station." Mason furrowed his brow. He didn't recognize the number, but something about the message stirred a sense of urgency in him. After a brief hesitation, he responded with a single word, "Okay." The next day, Mason found himself sitting at a small table in a quiet cafe, his foot tapping nervously under the table. His mind raced with possibilities about who had sent the message. Was it someone from the department? Internal affairs? Maybe one of his superiors wanted to talk off the record before the investigation concluded. Whatever the reason, Mason was on edge. The door chimed as someone entered the cafe, and Mason looked up. His heart skipped a beat when he saw her, Elena Harper. She walked in, dressed in casual clothes but with the same air of confidence and control she had exuded the day he'd arrested her. Mason hadn't expected to see her again, at least not like this. His stomach tightened, and he suddenly felt like a child caught doing something wrong. Elena spotted him immediately and made her way over to his table, her face neutral. She sat down across from him, not waiting for an invitation. Mason could see the calm, controlled anger behind her eyes, the kind of anger that didn't need to be shouted to be felt. "Agent Harper," Mason said, his voice hesitant. Elena looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "I thought it was time we had a conversation, Officer Donovan." Mason shifted in his seat. He hadn't expected this. In fact, he hadn't expected to speak to Elena again at all, especially not outside the confines of the investigation. "I didn't expect to hear from you," Mason admitted, his voice low. Elena leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I didn't do this for you, Donovan. I did this because I need you to understand something. something that I think you still don't fully grasp." Mason swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words before she had even begun explaining. He nodded, staying quiet. There was nothing he could say right now that wouldn't sound defensive, and deep down, he knew this wasn't the time to speak. It was the time to listen. "You think this is about your career, about a bad decision you made on the job," Elena began, her voice steady but firm. "And it is in part. But it's bigger than that, Donovan. This is about how people like you look at people like me." Mason flinched, the truth of her words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He had been telling himself that this was just a professional misstep, something that could be fixed with the right words and actions. But Elena wasn't letting him hide behind that excuse. "When you saw me that day, you didn't see an FBI agent. You didn't see someone who was doing her job. You saw a black woman on a bike in a neighborhood you thought she didn't belong in. And that was enough for you to make your decision," she said, her eyes never leaving his. Mason opened his mouth to speak, but Elena held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not interested in your excuses, Donovan. I've heard them all before. What I want to know is whether you understand the damage you did. Not just to me, but to every person who's been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment." Her words hit Mason like a freight train. He had been so focused on the personal consequences of his actions, his suspension, the internal investigation, the potential end of his career, that he hadn't truly considered the broader impact. His actions weren't just about him and Elena. They were about the system that allowed people like him to make snap judgments based on race, about the countless others who had been wronged in similar ways without ever receiving an apology, let alone justice. I'm sorry," Mason said, the words stumbling out awkwardly. "I know that doesn't change what happened, but I am." Elena leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Sorry isn't enough, Donovan. Not anymore. Do you know how many people have apologized to me for things like this? How many times I've been told that I don't belong somewhere, or that I'm suspicious just for existing?" Mason's throat tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he wasn't like the others, that he had just made a mistake. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. On that day, he had been like the others. He had been the problem. "I don't expect you to fix the system," Elena continued. "But you can fix yourself. You need to look at the way you see people, the way you make assumptions about them before you know who they are, because that's what led you to arrest me that day. And until you face that truth, nothing you say or do is going to matter." The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of her words. Mason felt his stomach churn with guilt, the reality of what she was saying sinking in deeper with every second. He had always thought of himself as one of the good guys, but now, sitting across from Elena, he realized just how much work he had to do, on himself, on his understanding of the world, and on the role he played in perpetuating the very system he thought he was protecting people from. "I want to do better," Mason said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how yet, but I want to try." Elena studied him for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained serious. "That's a start, but trying isn't enough. You need to actually change, Donovan, because if you don't, the next person you treat like that might not be as lucky as I was." Mason nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I promise." Elena stood up, her chair scraping against the floor as she pushed it back. "We'll see," she said simply. And with that, she turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Mason alone with his thoughts. Mason sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the empty seat across from him. Elena had given him something he didn't deserve, a chance at redemption. But it was up to him whether he would take it and actually change, or whether he would continue down the same path that had led him here. For the first time in a long time, Mason felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But that hope was tempered by the knowledge that change wouldn't come easily, and it certainly wouldn't come overnight. It was going to take work, hard, uncomfortable work. As Mason left the cafe, the air outside felt different. Lighter, somehow. But the road ahead was still long, and he knew that this was only the beginning of his journey toward making things right. Mason Donovan sat in his car for a long time after leaving the cafe, Elena Harper's words were playing over and over in his mind. The quiet determination in her voice, the steadiness in her gaze, they had cut through the layers of denial and self-righteousness that he had built up over the years. Her confrontation wasn't just about what had happened between them. It was about forcing him to look at himself, to really see the man he had become. It was the first time in his life that Mason had truly faced the reality of his biases, and it stung more than any reprimand or suspension ever could. He had spent so long telling himself that he was one of the good guys, that his instincts were always right. But Elena had shattered that illusion with a few simple truths. Now, as he sat in his car, watching people walk by on the busy street, Mason felt the weight of something larger than his personal guilt. He had been part of a system that perpetuated the very problems he thought he was protecting people from. And it wasn't just about his actions that day. It was about the countless moments that had led up to it, the jokes in the locker room, the assumptions he had made about people based on their appearance, the times he had let his biases guide his judgment without questioning them. For the first time, Mason understood that this wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about fundamentally changing who he was and how he saw the world. Over the next few weeks, Mason's life became a quiet reflection of the man he wanted to become. His suspension remained in effect, giving him more time than he had ever had to think, to question, and to confront the uglier parts of himself. He started reading books about implicit bias, systemic racism, and the history of law enforcement's relationship with marginalized communities. It was uncomfortable and humbling, but with every page, Mason felt his perspective shift. He saw the world through a lens he had never truly understood before. But reading and reflecting weren't enough. Mason knew that real change required action, and that meant making amends, not just to Elena but to the community he had sworn to protect. He started attending local community meetings, sitting quietly in the back and listening as people discussed their concerns about policing, about fairness, and about the fear that many felt when they saw someone in uniform. These meetings were eye-opening for Mason. They showed him a side of his community that he had been blind to for years. One evening, as he sat in a packed church basement during one of these meetings, a middle-aged black woman stood up to speak. She spoke about her son, a teenager who had been stopped by the police multiple times for no reason other than fitting a description. She talked about how her son had grown afraid to leave the house, how he felt targeted, how she feared every day that something might happen to him. Mason listened, his chest tightening with each word. He had never thought about what it felt like to live in constant fear of being profiled, of being stopped for simply existing. The woman's story hit too close to home. It wasn't just her son. How many people had Mason stopped over the years based on nothing more than a gut feeling that turned out to be wrong? After the meeting, Mason approached the woman. He introduced himself, told her who he was and why he was there. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and skepticism, but she listened. Mason apologized, sincerely, for his role in the system that had caused her and her son so much pain. It wasn't an easy conversation, and he knew his apology couldn't erase the years of fear and distrust, but it was a step, and she acknowledged that. As the days passed, Mason continued to attend these meetings, showing up, listening, and slowly beginning to rebuild the trust that had been broken. It wasn't just about making himself feel better. It was about understanding the pain he had contributed to and doing whatever he could to help repair it. Meanwhile, Elena Harper was moving forward in her own life. The undercover operation she had been part of wrapped up successfully, with the suspect apprehended and the case closed. She had earned praise from her superiors, and the offer of a promotion had come not long after. But even with her professional success, the encounter with Mason had left a lasting mark on her. It wasn't the first time she had been profiled, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But something about this particular situation had stuck with her. Elena had grown used to fighting her battles in silence, to letting her work speak for itself. She had always believed that the best way to combat prejudice was to rise above it, to prove through her success that she was just as capable, if not more so, than anyone else. But her conversation with Mason had been different. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about making someone see the damage they had done. Not just to her, but to an entire system of people who were tired of being seen as other. She had heard from colleagues that Mason was attending community meetings, trying to understand the broader impact of his actions. At first, she had been skeptical. It wasn't the first time she had seen someone try to make amends after being called out for their behavior. But something about Mason's efforts felt different. He wasn't just offering empty words or token gestures. He was putting in the work. One evening, after a long day at the bureau, Elena found herself thinking about Mason again. She debated whether or not to reach out, to check in on the progress he was making. Part of her didn't want to. He wasn't her responsibility after all. But another part of her, the part that believed in redemption, thought maybe it was worth seeing where things stood. 2 days later, she made her decision. Elena arrived at the same cafe where they had met weeks before. This time, she was the one who sent the message. Let's meet. Same place. Mason arrived early, clearly nervous as he waited for her to arrive. When she walked in, the same air of confidence and purpose surrounded her, but there was something different this time, something lighter. Mason stood up as she approached, offering a nod of acknowledgement, but it was Elena who spoke first. I've heard you've been making some changes, she said, sitting down across from him. Mason nodded, his voice quiet. I've been trying. Elena studied him for a moment, her eyes searching for sincerity. Why? Mason paused, gathering his thoughts. Because I needed to. That day, I saw myself for what I really was, and I didn't like what I saw. I've spent too long thinking I was doing the right thing without ever questioning why I thought that in the first place. I needed to face that, and I needed to change. Elena nodded slowly, recognizing the honesty in his words. It's a start. They sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them not entirely gone but softer now, more reflective. Mason was far from perfect, and they both knew that. But the fact that he had chosen to confront his own flaws and work to make things right mattered. It wouldn't fix everything, but it was a step in the right direction. As they finished their conversation, Elena stood to leave, but before she did, she turned to Mason with one final piece of advice. Keep showing up, Donovan, she said, because people like me don't get to stop showing up, not for a single day. Mason nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. I will, he promised. Elena gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval, then turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Mason to sit with the enormity of the journey ahead of him. For Mason Donovan, this was just the beginning of a long road toward redemption. There were no quick fixes or easy solutions, only hard work and uncomfortable truths. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to face them. Months later, Mason found himself standing in front of a group of new recruits at the police academy. His role had changed. He wasn't out on the streets anymore, but he had found a new way to contribute. He had become an instructor, teaching young officers about implicit bias, community policing, and the importance of seeing people as more than just potential threats. Elena Harper, now a senior agent, continued to break barriers in her career. Her work remained focused on justice, not just for individuals, but for a system that desperately needed change. And while she and Mason never became close, they shared a mutual respect for each other, an understanding that change was possible, even for those who seemed beyond it. And so, life moved forward. The wheels of karma had turned, and both Elena and Mason had come out on the other side, changed, but not broken. They had faced the weight of prejudice, and come to understand that the fight for justice wasn't just about catching criminals or closing cases. It was about something much deeper. The fight for fairness, for equality, and for a world where people were seen for who they truly were, not for what others assumed them to be. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.